October 12, 1943. Normandy, France. Dawn rolled slowly over the countryside, settling like a pale veil across the orchards and stone houses. A cold mist clung to the earth, thin as breath on glass, and the early light crept between the branches of apple trees stripped bare by autumn. In the quiet village of St. Clair, the world seemed frozen in a fragile stillness, as if waiting for something to shift, something to break the silence. Through that mist stepped a 13-year-old girl named Elise Moreau. She carried a basket of eggs in her small hands, the woven handle pressing gently against her fingers. Her wooden shoes clicked softly on the stone steps of her family's farmhouse, and her breath formed faint clouds in the chilly morning air. She looked like any other farm girl beginning another ordinary day beneath the watchful presence of the occupying German soldiers. But there was something different about her. It sat untouched by the cold, glowing faintly even in the dim light. A bright red ribbon tied neatly into her hair. The color was as bold as spilled paint against the grayness of the morning, and anyone paying attention would have noticed it immediately. Elise seemed unaware of its brightness. She walked calmly, almost silently, as though trying to blend into the fog. Yet the ribbon made her impossible to ignore. To most villagers, it was simply a keepsake from her late mother, a harmless piece of cloth, a memory she refused to let fade. Elise allowed them to believe that. Sometimes she even leaned into the story, letting her fingers brush the ribbon as if for comfort. But beneath that simple explanation lived a secret far heavier than her small frame suggested. The ribbon had become a signal, a quiet warning, a silent beam of defiance placed directly under the noses of the very soldiers who patrolled her streets. Elise reached the end of the stone path and looked down the long road that wound past the orchard. German boots would soon strike that road in their usual rhythm of morning patrol, and she knew every crack and shadow along the route. Her eyes scanned carefully. No movement yet. She shifted her basket and walked toward the chicken coop, humming a tune she did not quite feel. Her voice was soft, but her ears were sharp. She listened for anything out of place. A snapped twig, a heavy breath, the scrape of leather on stone. For 2 months, she had lived like this, alert, balanced between two lives, the child she appeared to be and the courier she never meant to become. It had all begun one afternoon in August. Elise had been gathering firewood near the old mill when she noticed something moving along the edge of the reeds, something crawling. She approached slowly, heart pounding at the thought of a fox or an injured boar. But when the shape lifted its head, she froze. It was a man, his uniform torn, his face streaked with mud and exhaustion, a foreign insignia on his sleeve. Not German, British. He whispered his name, Samuel Cook, a Royal Air Force gunner. His bomber had fallen from the sky the night before, torn apart by fire and tracer rounds. He had hidden in the marshes until morning and barely escaped capture when patrol combed the riverbank. He was weak, cold, desperate. Elise knew she should have run. She knew the penalty for hiding an Allied airman. Her teacher spoke of it in frightening whispers. Her neighbors spoke of it in fear. Yet something in Samuel's trembling voice anchored her feet to the ground. He needed help, real help, and she was the only person there. She led him toward the abandoned grain shed behind her family's orchard. It was a small structure with broken windows and a sliding door that stuck in its track. German soldiers never bothered with it. They believed it held nothing of value. That made it perfect. Elise brought him bread that night, cheese the next, water whenever she could slip out unnoticed. She covered his footprints, wiped away traces of his passage, and said nothing to anyone. It was supposed to be temporary, a day, 2 days. Then he would slip away under cover of darkness and find a resistance contact. But the days stretched on, and everything changed again. A second man appeared. Elise had been leading her family's goats to pasture when she heard someone stumbling through the underbrush. She turned and saw a young man, barely older than her brother would have been, limping heavily and clutching his side. His uniform was not British. His accent was unmistakably American. Another pilot, another survivor, and he carried a grave truth. More airmen from his crew were scattered across the countryside, injured, lost, being hunted. The Germans were not looking for just one man. They were setting traps for several. Elise realized She needed a system. Something small. Something no one would question. Something that could be seen from a hiding place, but dismissed by soldiers. She untied her mother's ribbon that night, held it in her hands, felt the weight of what she was about to do. The next morning, she tied it into her hair. The signal was born. If the pilots saw the ribbon, the road was clear. If she wore no ribbon, danger waited nearby. And if she wore it at the base of her braid instead of the top, it meant patrols had shifted and escape routes had changed. For 3 weeks, the ribbon carried messages even when Elise could not speak. 6 men had already passed safely through the village and into barns, cellars, and hidden tunnels beneath the old chapel. The Germans had no idea, at least not yet, but something was coming. Elise felt it in the way the mist settled, in the way the soldiers walked, in the way silence stretched longer between footsteps. And as she approached the chicken coop, a faint clicking sound echoed from the road. Boots. Several pairs. Earlier than usual. Elise stiffened. The patrol had changed. She slowly lowered the basket, her face calm despite the racing of her heartbeat. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, careful to let the red ribbon show clearly. For a brief moment she wished she could be a child again, a simple girl in a quiet village untouched by war. But the world had chosen differently for her. The boots grew louder, closer, and then the first German voice cut through the air. Footsteps stopped. Eyes watched. The mist thinned. Elise stood perfectly still, the red ribbon catching the dim morning light. Everything depended on what she did next. If you are watching this and you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, please subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. Like this story, share it, and comment where in the world you are watching from. Your support keeps these untold stories alive. The patrol commander took another step toward Elise. He studied her calmly, quietly, as if trying to read something in her expression. Elise dipped her head slightly, pretending to focus on her basket, but her pulse thundered. She did not know whether Samuel was watching from the grain shed. She did not know if the American pilot had reached the mill. She did not know who else might be hiding within sight of her. She only knew that the ribbon had to speak for her. The officer gave a low grunt. The soldiers moved on, boots fading into the distance. Elise waited until the last echo died before she finally exhaled. But the danger had not passed. This change in patrol pattern meant someone knew something. Someone suspected something. Someone had been watching too closely. And by nightfall, the village would face a threat far more dangerous than an early patrol, because a new officer was coming, a man whose eyes missed nothing, and he had already seen Elise before. Evening settled over St. Clair with an unusual heaviness, as if the air itself sensed what was coming. Lanterns flickered behind shuttered windows, and the sound of distant artillery rolled faintly across the hills. Elise moved through the village with caution, her basket now filled with folded linens to give her an excuse for being out. But every shadow seemed longer tonight. Every corner felt sharper. Every face looked more uncertain. The first sign of trouble appeared when she passed the baker's shop. The door, usually propped open even at dusk, was shut tight. A single candle burned behind the narrow pane of glass, but no one stood inside. The baker and his wife were hiding. They only did that when officers were near. Elise paused just long enough to glance at the nearby road. Fresh tire tracks scarred the dirt in wide arcs, far deeper than those made by the usual morning patrol trucks. These tracks belonged to something heavier, something official. A new vehicle had arrived. She continued walking, her steps slow and deliberate. She kept her head lowered and her ribbon hidden beneath her scarf. Tonight was not a day for signals. Tonight was a day for silence. Her path led her toward the old mill at the river's bend. The building stood like a crooked sentinel, its wooden wheel half broken and its stone walls cracked from decades of storms. The river whispered at its base, carrying secrets past reeds and under moss-covered logs. Elise slipped behind the structure, careful to avoid the muddy spots that could reveal her footprints. Inside the mill ruins, 2 figures stirred the moment she appeared. Samuel Cook, the RAF gunner she had rescued first, crouched near the stone wall with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The American pilot, younger and limping heavily, leaned against a support beam. His name was Andrew Collins, though he had told her to call him Drew. Both men looked exhausted. Elise lifted a small cloth bundle. Bread, dried apples, a pinch of salt she had taken from her father's old wooden chest. Drew whispered first. German trucks passed the ridge an hour ago. She nodded. She had heard them too. Heard the way their engines strained climbing the slope. Heard the tense voices of soldiers riding inside. They were searching for someone. Maybe pilots. Maybe someone else. But their tension meant one thing. Something had changed. Samuel took a slow breath. We need to move at first light. The resistance contact is supposed to meet us near the chapel ruins. Elise hesitated. She looked toward the door, listening again for footsteps. The Germans checked the chapel often now. She had seen them circle it twice that morning. Something in her expression made Samuel straighten. What is it? He asked. She finally spoke. A new officer is here. Samuel's eyes narrowed. Drew frowned. Elise continued, her voice only a whisper. He came from Paris. He watches everything. His men follow him without question. And he recognized someone today. Samuel leaned closer. Who? Elise hesitated. She felt the weight of the truth pressing against her ribs. Me. The two pilots exchanged quick glances. They knew the risk. They had seen innocent signals misunderstood. Heard stories of entire families taken because a single clue pointed the wrong direction. Samuel spoke softly but firmly. Then we must leave sooner. Tonight, if possible. But Drew shook his head. With my leg, I will slow you both down. And the patrols are heavier after sunset. Samuel looked to Elise for guidance. She knew every stone, every path, every hollow tree along the village edges. She listened again for distant noise. The night answered only with the river. We wait, she said. You cannot move until after the morning patrol changes shift. But you cannot stay here either. Tomorrow they will search the mills. Samuel's jaw tightened. Where then? Elise lifted her chin slightly. The root cellar under the old schoolhouse. Germans do not know it has a second entrance. It was built during the last war. The plan formed quickly. Elise would guide them after dawn, using the ribbon to judge the safest moment. But dawn was hours away, and the night grew colder with every minute. She left the mill quietly and returned toward the village. The streets were empty now. The lanterns and homes flickered behind thick curtains. Somewhere a dog barked, then fell silent. Elise reached the corner of the square, preparing to turn toward her house, when she noticed a group of soldiers standing in formation near the well. At their center stood the new officer, Kruger. His coat was pressed to a sharp stiffness, his hands clasped neatly behind his back. His eyes, narrow and unblinking, moved across the square with slow precision. He did not speak. He only watched, absorbing every detail, as if filing it into some mental ledger. Elise froze. Kruger's gaze swept across the rows of houses, across the darkened windows, across the few villagers still outside. Then his eyes shifted. They reached the shadow where Elise stood. He held her in his stare for a long moment. Then he stepped forward. Her pulse quickened. She could not tell whether he recognized her instantly or whether something in her posture caught his attention. But she felt exposed, vulnerable, seen. Kruger stopped only a few feet away. For a moment he said nothing. Then his voice cut through the square with a chilling calm. You live in the farmhouse at the end of the road. Yes. Elise nodded slowly. You wear a ribbon in your hair, he said softly. A very bright one. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. His tone was controlled, almost gentle, but something beneath it was sharp, as if every word carried an edge. Elise kept her answer simple. It belonged to my mother. Interesting, Kruger said. I have seen it before. Her stomach tightened. She did not look away. She could not. Kruger studied her for a long moment. Then he turned toward his men and issued orders she could not hear. Within seconds, the soldiers dispersed into nearby streets, knocking on doors, questioning. Villagers. Kruger walked away without another word. But the threat remained. When Elise reached home, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her mother's ribbon in the mirror. She traced its edges with trembling fingers. She had worn it proudly for weeks, as a signal, as a shield, as a thread connecting her to those fighting far beyond her quiet village. But now it had marked her. She closed her eyes. Drew and Samuel depended on her. 3 other airmen scattered near the wood line depended on her. And somewhere out there, Kruger pieced together every clue he found. She had no choice. At dawn, she had to be braver than she had ever been. That night, she barely slept. She listened to the distant engines of German trucks rumbling through the valley. She heard soldiers shouting at doors and villagers answering with frightened voices. Once, she heard boots stop directly outside her window. She held her breath until they moved on. Just before sunrise, the sky shifted from deep blue to pale gray. Birds stirred quietly in the orchard. Elise slipped from her house and made her way through the tall grass behind the barn. She reached a small hill overlooking the mill. A thin plume of smoke rose from a soldier's camp near the river. Patrols had doubled. Elise felt her stomach twist. She lifted a hand toward her hair, remembering the code. Today the ribbon must be tied low, near the base of her braid. It meant caution. Heavy patrols. Only move if absolutely necessary. She tied it slowly, her fingers steady even though her nerves were not. She stepped toward the mill path. Then she stopped. A dark figure already stood near the water, staring toward the ruins. Kruger. He was there, before dawn, watching, waiting. Elise's breath caught as the wind shifted, carrying faint voices from the riverbank. Soldiers were spreading out, forming lines, closing in. Drew and Samuel were still inside the mill, and Kruger was between her and them. Her next step would determine everything that happened after. Dawn crept slowly over St. Clair, brushing the rooftops with thin streaks of gold. The mist began to lift, carrying the night's tension upward like smoke. But nothing in the village felt lighter. The silence felt too controlled, too careful, as if the entire countryside held its breath. Elise stepped behind the row of apple trees, keeping herself hidden among the trunks as she assessed the path to the mill. Kruger stood near the water, his hands resting behind his back, his gaze anchored on the ruins, as if he were waiting for a secret to reveal itself. He did not move. He did not speak. He simply watched. The river whispered along the stones. A crow flew overhead. Somewhere behind her, a door creaked open as a villager began the morning chores. But nothing at the mill stirred. The 2 airmen were still inside, unaware that the most dangerous man in the valley stood between them and safety. Elise's mind raced. The root cellar beneath the old schoolhouse was still their best hope. It had 2 entrances, one hidden beneath an overgrown shrub, one beneath a loose floorboard inside the abandoned classroom. But reaching it required crossing the open square. Doing that while Kruger prowled the mill path was impossible. She needed to distract him. Elise remained completely still behind the trees, studying his movements. He shifted slightly, tilting his head toward the river as if listening for something only he could hear. His attention was fixed on the mill. He believed something was inside, something worth waiting for. Elise knew she could not approach the mill directly. Kruger would notice even the faintest movement. She had to act elsewhere. She moved along the orchard carefully, her small feet barely disturbing the grass. The barn stood ahead, and beyond it the pasture. The goats bleated softly inside their pen. That sound gave her an idea. She opened the gate only partway and nudged the largest goat gently toward the path. It hesitated, then trotted out, hoofs clacking on stones. Elise kept her distance, making sure the goat wandered toward the mill from the opposite angle. A harmless animal exploring the morning. Kruger turned slightly when he heard the hoofbeats. Elise watched his posture stiffen. His gaze shifted from the mill ruins to the goat as it wandered across the path and sniffed at the bushes. Kruger stepped closer, but did not draw attention to himself. He simply observed. This was her only chance. She slipped behind the barn and moved toward the old shed. From there she could reach the riverbank through a narrow trail no soldier ever used. The path was muddy and uneven, but she had walked it many times before. Her breath came steady. Her steps were measured. She kept her red ribbon tied low, hidden beneath her scarf so it would not catch the light. The riverbank brought her closer to the mill, without crossing Kruger's line of sight. The air was colder here. The sound of water drowned out distant noises. Elise crept toward the back entrance of the ruins. the place where the stones had crumbled enough to create an opening wide enough for a child or a desperate man. She whispered into the shadows, "It is not safe. You must move now." Samuel appeared first. His face was tight with worry, his uniform soaked at the sleeves from a leaking roof beam. Drew struggled behind him, leaning heavily against the wall. Elise motioned urgently toward the small trail. "You cannot stay," she said quietly. "Kruger is here." Samuel's jaw tightened. He nodded once. Drew swallowed hard and followed. Elise walked ahead of them, leading the way through the trees, careful to avoid leaving obvious tracks. Branches brushed her shoulders. Leaves rustled underfoot. Every sound felt too loud. From the trail's edge, Elise peered toward the mill again. Kruger was no longer alone. 2 soldiers had joined him. They inspected the ground, pointing toward the entrance that Elise herself had just used. One soldier knelt. Another lifted a broken twig. Kruger watched their findings with a cold certainty, as if confirming something he had suspected all along. Elise knew they had only minutes. She turned and guided the pilots toward a cluster of haystacks behind the old schoolhouse. The structure stood near the edge of the village, partially hidden by trees. The walls had lost most of their paint. The roof sagged slightly, yet it still offered some shelter. Most importantly, the Germans rarely checked it. Elise led them to the backside, where tall bushes grew thick enough to conceal the narrow entrance hidden beneath them. She crouched, lifting the branches and exposing a set of worn wooden steps leading down into darkness. "Go inside," she whispered. Samuel helped Drew descend. The root cellar was cold and damp. Shelves lined the walls, still holding jars of vegetables left from years before. Dust coated everything. The air smelled of earth. It was cramped but safe. Samuel nodded in silent gratitude. Elise would have followed them inside if she did not know what she needed to do next. She had to throw the soldiers off their trail. "Stay here," she said firmly. "Do not move until you hear the bell from the chapel tower. That is your signal." "The chapel was abandoned," Samuel said. "Yes," she replied, "but the bell still sounds when someone pulls the rope." They both understood what she meant. Elise would have to reach it herself. She would have to cross the square while soldiers searched the mill, while Kruger questioned villagers, while patrols tightened their nets. She turned to leave, but Drew stopped her, his voice weak. "Why are you doing this? You are only a child." Elise looked back at him, her eyes steady. "Because someone must." She climbed the steps and lowered the branches back into place. The hidden entrance vanished beneath the tangle of leaves. She took a moment to steady her breathing. The chapel rose just beyond the square. Its broken roof and leaning tower cast long shadows across the stones. Reaching it would not be easy. Elise stepped into the open. The village square was busier than she expected. Soldiers clustered near doorways, questioning residents. A few villagers carried buckets or tools, trying to appear as though they were beginning their morning chores. One old man swept the cobblestones with trembling hands. His eyes widened when he saw Elise, but she shook her head subtly, telling him to say nothing. She walked slowly, keeping her pace natural. She carried no basket today, no groceries, no water pail. She had only her scarf and the hidden ribbon beneath it. Halfway across the square, she felt a chill run through her. Kruger stood near the well. He turned his head slightly. His eyes followed her movements, not aggressively, not suspiciously, but with a careful curiosity, as though he were fitting together pieces of a puzzle he could not yet solve. Elise forced herself not to falter. Her steps remained steady. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to let her fear show in her posture. She reached the base of the chapel steps. The tower loomed above her. The rope that controlled the bell hung near the entrance, frayed from age, but still usable. She raised her hand. Before she could touch the rope, a voice spoke behind her. "Why do you walk alone this morning?" She froze. Kruger stood only a few feet away. His presence felt like a shadow stretching across the chapel. His eyes dropped to her scarf. She knew he was looking for the ribbon. She also knew the slightest wrong answer could lead him straight to the cellar. Elise turned slowly, her face calm. "I am going to light a candle," she said, "for my mother." Kruger studied her silently. His expression did not change, but his eyes sharpened. He looked at her scarf again, then at the chapel door, then back at her face. A long moment passed. Then he stepped aside. Elise reached for the rope and pulled hard. The chapel bell rang through the valley, echoing between houses and across the orchard. Birds scattered into the sky. Villagers paused. Soldiers looked up. Drew and Samuel would hear it. But Elise could not yet leave. Kruger stood between her and the path home. The bell's echo faded. The wind shifted. Boots approached from behind the officer. 3 soldiers joined him, saluting quickly. They handed him a folded paper. Kruger opened it. His eyes scanned the page. Something in his posture stiffened. He lifted his gaze toward Elise again. He took one step closer. The square fell silent. What happened next remained uncertain to everyone who later tried to tell the story. Some claimed Kruger questioned her. Others claimed he turned away. And there were those who insisted that something in the bell's echo startled him, causing him to shift his attention just long enough for Elise to slip past. No one agreed on the exact moment, but they all remembered one thing. Elise walked away from the chapel, and no one could say for sure what Kruger learned from that morning. The air shifted around them. The village held its breath, and Elise took the next step that would determine the fate of every hidden pilot. Please share, like, comment, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends to get more stories like this. Tell us where in the world you are watching from. Your support helps keep these forgotten heroes alive.